Welcome to TISConversations, where we discuss issues related to understanding life from a trauma-informed lens. I'm Heather Forbes with the Beyond Consequences Institute. In today's episode, we're going to have a fun conversation with Jim Sporleder. And I say fun conversation because I want to not only talk about implementing a trauma-informed school from the administrator's perspective, but also to weave in stories of students. So we're going to have a little story time as well. So hi, Jim.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm great. Hey, give us a little background of your history so that our listeners know who you are and what you bring to the table here.
Well, I started my career in 1977. Started out teaching special education and in California, and then moved to Walla Walla, Washington. Was out of education for a few years and missed it horribly, and got back in and was hired at a middle school to be the special ed teacher there. And at that middle school, I eventually became the assistant principal, and it was my dream job. I'd been there for 22 years. Very grateful to be in a school that I started in Washington State and that I was going to retire in. And little did I know that my destiny was going to take a change. So I got a radio call from my secretary, which to tell me that I had a visitor in my office. And kind of the unspoken word with us administrators is we have our secretaries protect us from any salespeople. So I told her, I said, well, I didn't see anything on my calendar. I said, you didn't let a salesman in, did you? And she goes, I don't know. And I said, is it a parent? And she goes, no. So anyway, I went down to my office and I met the gentleman, and he was doing an assessment on our district's alternative programs. I had no idea that the district had hired anybody to do that. Honestly, I didn't understand why he was at Garrison, the school that I was principal at, why he had come by to share it with me. But he chose to do that, told me a little bit about the results, left the report with me, and later on I actually read the report, and it was so devastating. The pain that the kids were in, the pain that the staff was in. I knew the history of the school. It wasn't called Lincoln, it was called Payne Alternative High School. I just kept telling my wife, somebody needs to get over there and help those kids out. Nobody should feel this way. And I've always felt no student should ever come into a school building and not feel safe. And finally, I realized that I was being called, and I went down and asked my superintendent if he would transfer me in the fall. First thing he said to me is, why would you want to go to that school? I asked him if he had read the report. I went over for a visit, and they put an intern at the school. And so I went over for a visit thinking that the kids would just be so excited to meet their new principal for the following year. And my ego was crushed. They weren't excited to see me. And I was there for 2 days, and I have never walked into a more out of control school environment. I always say that my jaw was taped to my chest. I mean, it was stuck to my chest. I just could not believe what I was seeing. The disregard for any request was met with FU. The gangs had control of the building. I knew the reputation of the school. I knew it was a dumping ground for our traditional high school, but wow. In 2 days, I suspended about 12 kids. Went back to the superintendent and said, I can't wait till the fall. I need to get over there now. And he denied me. I kept going back, and finally he kind of blew up at me and said, what don't you understand about no? And I said, well, if you'll go down and talk to staff and they tell you that they feel safe, I won't come in and bug you anymore. So he called me that afternoon and said, you can go. So I actually went over early part of April, and it took me clear to the end of June to where I finally felt like the kids saw me as a advocate. But trying to get control of that environment, I honestly had days I didn't know if I was going to make it or not.
Sounds like the school grew into its name by the name of Payne. which is isn't that the irony of it? And I know you ended up changing the name as well, but it's just so interesting. And when you say that someone asked you, why would you want to go to that school? I just kept reflecting because when I first started my work in the schools, I did the same. I jumped into the school that no one else wanted to go to. And they're like, well, why do you want to go there? So I totally relate to you. When you say that the kids were out of control, give us a little more understanding of what that is. I mean, most of us can imagine that, but I believe that you saw something that is so far beyond what is typically seen.
Well, I think what kept me in the game is I went over there, and this was before I had any knowledge of trauma, but I went over there because it was obvious reading that report that the kids had no self value. They felt like they even said it, we're labeled the worst kids, we're labeled the druggies, nobody wants us. And so I went over there trying with the intent to change the culture. But I went over there with a traditional mindset. That's all I knew. Man, to try to get on top of that, really in your face defiance, people say, well, how'd you handle it? And I said, I carried a big stick. I called the probation officers in. I had a meeting with the chief of police. I shared that we got to come together as a team to get control of this building. We really partnershiped on that, and eventually I got my own SRO. It was a journey that I'll be internally grateful for, but we went through the fire, believe me, before we were able to start seeing some of those significant changes that brought hope and healing.
And so those changes, I know what happened because I know your story, but those changes happened because you changed. Those changes happened because you were able to start seeing these children from the perspective of trauma. So tell us a little bit more about what that did instead of carrying that stick around, how you were able to shift your mindset.
It actually took a conference. I went to a conference, Resiliency to Hope, and Dr. John Medina was the keynote. And I've never been able to articulate exactly how I felt. It was in 90 minutes, he just turned my life upside down. And for years, I had said that my discipline teaches I don't punish kids. Punishing kids means you hurt them. And through Dr. Medina's presentation, it was the first time I ever heard the term toxic stress. It's the first time I had heard about cortisol and how when that overflows the brain, puts the kids in that high flight, flight, freeze mode. Where he really knocked me off my feet is I always believed that behavior was a choice, and I always believed that every kid could learn. And I took a very strong stance that it was my job to teach them about their behavior and give them a consequence that would create the change. And through Dr. Medina's keynote, it was very evident to me that I was punishing kids, and that was just devastating. In 90 minutes, I hit the back doors knowing that I needed to change, that I was punishing kids, which meant I was hurting them. I went looking for the curriculum, the how-to, and there was none. And so it was a little bit, it was a little bit of a panic mode, really. Find some resources and some support around these concepts. Thank God I had a community champion that got behind me and got me me and my staff some training around ACEs and adverse childhood experiences. And I told my staff straight up when I got back, I said, I've been punishing kids. You're going to see a whole different approach in discipline. And I was just so fortunate that at that time, I had the majority of the staff behind me, and they were relationship oriented, and our journey took off, and we saw a significant impact from the very beginning. In reality, I also had my naysayers, and they could make life challenging at times.
That's a very diplomatic way of putting it, Jim. So, and for you all listening, the reason I asked Jim to come on to this episode is that we collaborated because I was just so impressed with his work. he is the author, along with me on the back end here, but of the Trauma Informed School, a step-by-step implementation guide for administrators and school personnel. Because Jimmy, you were able to make those changes, and like you just said, there was no manual, there was no guide, and I know that that was really your passion then, to make sure that you took your experiences and put that into, like you say, a step-by-step implementation guide to make that happen. And so I want to go through a few of the concepts that we talk about in the book, and then, of course, add some stories around that. When we talk about that idea of behavior and discipline and accountability, that's, I think, one of the biggest pieces that people have a very big challenge around, is that we are so just we are raised to believe that we have to be punished when we do something wrong, and there's this real black and white between good and bad, and punishment and accountability. Talk to us a little bit about how accountability really comes through relationship, and that is one of the chapters in the book about accountability in relationship.
And I also want to give you a big shout out because the book never would have hit the market without your help, and so I'm always grateful and appreciate that so much.
Oh, thanks.
When I talk about the disregard for authority and FU was such a dominant response that my approach to that was we've got to teach these kids that when they get into the real world, that's unacceptable. And so I would call a student in and I would give them that life lesson that I thought what was a productive conversation, but little did I know they weren't hearing a thing I was saying. But when I changed, or when I knew I needed to change, and I tell the story every time because it was the first kid that came in that had told the teacher to F off, that I wasn't going to give him an automatic 3-day suspension in my little life story lesson. And when the kid came in, instead of telling them, this isn't how we talk to each other here, this is, these about the expectations, I simply just said, Jared, it doesn't sound like you. What's going on? He told me. And so here I'm sitting there, and this kid's just pouring his heart out about how his dad's let him down all of his life, what a drunk he is, and he's never come through for him, and he's hated his dad. And that particular day, he said, Sporleder, it's my birthday today, and I came to school and I was so pissed. And he said with a little bit more emphasis. And he said his dad had promised him that during the night he was going to sneak his car over to him for his 16th birthday. And he said, I believed him. I thought he was going to really do something this time. And he talked about, I got up early in the morning and ran and looked out the drapes and no car. And he just pounded his hand down on the table. And he says, he did it to me again. He let me down again. But what I noticed, Heather, is that as he's talking to me, sharing such intense feelings, I'm watching this kid come down. All I did was like, I mean, it was a devastating story. And I said, Jared, I never knew this. And I said, I'm so sorry. And it's that validating their feelings and their voice. And all of a sudden he's in a calm state. And he says to me, teacher didn't deserve that. I got to apologize. I don't feel good about what I did. We processed that. I told him he needed to do that on his own time. I never forced kids to apologize. I wanted to be sincere. But I told him, I'm not sending you home, Jared. I'm keeping you in school. I'm going to do an in-school consequence, not an out-of-school. And he says, thank you. But I'll never forget, Heather, that before he left my office, he turned around and he said, hey, Sporleder, thanks for talking to me. He says, it really, really helped. And in my mind, it's like, we didn't really have a conversation. and the other thought I had, which was devastating, was, my God, he would have had a 3-day, you're out, and I never would have heard the story. I would never have heard what caused it. The most powerful thing is, as we changed our approach and started asking versus telling them what they did wrong, the kids consistently told us. And when they were calm, they never felt good about what they did. They always would say, I don't feel good about that. And Jared had gone out after school and gave his teacher just a beautiful apology, and they connected. That was my first experience at changing my approach. And it was just so highly motivating. I was telling everybody that would listen to me about what I experienced with Jared. And then as kids kept coming in, as I asked them, what's going on? What do you think caused that? Or, man, you look like you're under a lot of stress today. Tell me about it. Kids started telling us their stories. And, again, in the back of your mind, you're just thinking, how'd they even make it to school today?
When you say it's about asking instead of telling, that is everything. When it doesn't feel like you're doing anything, again, I think we're so programmed to do something, to make something happen, to give a consequence, to give a punishment. I think it goes back to that concept of learning to understand what it means about being. Instead of doing, it is being. And I always like to say we are human beings, not human doings. And by just listening and offering that, what I call emotional space that you gave to Jared to be able to pour his heart out, that to me is accountability, right? Because
Hmm?
it's much harder to be vulnerable and to share that information. I know a lot of students who actually would rather you just suspend them. They don't want to give their story. They don't want to share. It takes a lot of courage for him to be able to do that as well. And so did you ever have teachers or anyone, like you said, some of the ones that gave pushback to still then say, well, now that he's calm and now he's giving a story, well, now can I give a consequence?
I've always said that accountability is critical, because we have to teach these kids where the parameters are, where the boundaries are. So I think the difference is, in a traditional approach, you give the consequence right up front when they're in the red, and they can't problem solve, they can't process with you. And so the change that we had is that we waited till they calmed down, then we processed, and we would bring the consequence up at the end of the conversation, and the kids were ready for it. They wanted to make it right. When they were in the red, and I was pushing in my traditional mode, day of ISS could turn into a day of suspension, because I would trigger. When we bring it at the end, then you're not only providing a consequence and helping to make a right into a wrong, or excuse me, a wrong into a right, but you're connecting. That's the part that was so powerful for me, and such a learning experience and fuel that kept my fire burning, is that here I'm disciplining a whole different approach. And instead of the kids walking out of my office ticked off and cussing and taking their suspension days and going, I had kids connected. We were connecting. And as I taught them about their behaviors, about where the boundaries are, and about how to be emotional safe and all, then they started advocating for that. And now that came through relationship. And it wasn't difficult to get kids to calm down once we had that culture and had some momentum behind it, because they expected it. They knew we were going to let them calm down. They knew we were going to work through whatever the issue was.
Nice. And when we talk about then that suspension, let's talk about the difference between the out of school suspension, or like you told him, you gave him an in school suspension. And in the book, we do talk about the in school suspension room and how to set one up. But talk to us a little bit about how that change happened and what was the response from some of the students around that.
Well, it was kind of comical at first, because like you shared earlier, when I first changed from suspensions with some of the kids to ISS, they wanted to argue with me. They wanted the suspension. They didn't want to do the ISS. And, I'd say, well, why in the world do you want them to be suspended instead of going to in school? And they said, because I don't want to have to do my classwork. And that's when I thought, we're on the right track here. And so when we went with in school, and once it becomes part of your culture, kids appreciate that. And when we look at our high-risk kids, they don't normally have great attendance. If you do suspend them out of school, they don't come back and ask for missed work to get caught up. And so when you keep the consequences in school as much as possible, you're holding them accountable for their attendance. You're holding them accountable to do their schoolwork, and you have them in an environment with a caring adult that's available to them. And what I really found out in my last year at Lincoln, I found out and really came to the realization, I used to ask myself, when has the lesson been learned? And I found that when we were in relationship with kids, I might say you've got a 3-day in-school suspension, and then I'd go check on them. They'd be busting their tail, getting their work done. I could see the lesson was already learned, and I'd go up to a student, pull them aside, and just say, "Man, you're knocking it out of the ballpark, but I appreciate it. Get back to your regular schedule." And we were able to even to do that with major offenses. I can remember an assault that we had before the kids left the office. I could tell the lesson was already learned. Obviously, I was a little bit more intense on the consequence, but they knew that they were loved. They knew that we were going to be there for them, but they also had to deal with the consequence of that.
And when you talk about being a little bit more intense, I know there's a story in the book I want you to maybe share about the student that did have to be arrested, because there were some offenses that were against the law that your SRO had to arrest this student, but you did it with such humanity, with such grace, if there is such a thing to arrest a child, but to do it to make sure that this child had dignity.
I hate to admit this, but when I was in that environment that was out of control, and I had my SRO, I actually used the term, if we have a gang infraction, I want them cuffed and stuffed. And I want the message to be out there where this isn't going to fly. The gang stuff's not going to fly in this building. So from that attitude of cuff and stuff, and wanting others to be able to witness that if you're going to do this behavior, you're going to get handcuffed and you're going to be taken straight to the squad car. When that individual that I just referred to that had the assault, we brought kids in, and we taught our SROs how to be trauma informed. And so we would tell our kids, we'd let them know, hey, this infraction went over the top. We can't have this kind of violence in school. In fact, it crosses that line where we're going to have to do an arrest. No surprises here, we want you to know, but we're not going to do the arrest until kids are in class. We're not going to handcuff you in the office. We're going to have you walk out with Matt, and by law, he will have to handcuff you when you get to the car, but we're not going to parade you out of here handcuffed. And just in that approach, it's hard to explain. I mean, the girl, she was crying and she gave us a big hug before she was taken. And the other thing that we did is we had an adult down in the juvenile facility within 45 minutes of them. If we ever had to take a student to the JJC, we had an adult there within an hour to process with them, and never once had a student that wasn't happy to see us or to see Brooke come in.
Wow. So you had one of your staff then leave campus and go take care of the emotional needs of that student.
Right, as quick as we could. And that only came because of our partnership with the JJC, is that they allowed us to come down and go back to where the kids were locked up and intake was. And they even gave us a room by ourselves with the kid to process. And so that was a powerful thing to happen. And it really, I think, gave the student that message is, hey, yeah, you made a mistake, but we're here. We're going to work through it, and we love you. We had gang members that when we met with them that we were in tears saying, man, I messed up. I'm so sorry.
That's incredibly powerful. And I can just imagine that when they did return to school, the difference, because, that embarrassment, that shame coming back after being arrested, but to decrease all of that and to basically welcome them back with open arms, that had to have had a huge impact on their behaviors and their connections at school after those incidences as well.
As our culture, trauma, I call it trauma responsive, as it became who we were versus what we did. We would have kids say that had a probation violation that may have gotten locked up The JJC facility was about 5 blocks away from Lincoln, and man, when they were released, first place they would sprint to Lincoln just to connect with us. And I look at that versus the emergency expulsion and the arrest and a traditional mindset versus still holding kids accountable, but with compassion. Boy, what a difference.
It's just huge. And so, talk to us a little bit about how you were able then to develop that relationship with JJC. I also know that on your campus, you were able to get a mental health facility right next door. I think one of the things that we have to expand our thinking is if we're going to implement a very strong and bountiful trauma informed platform in a school, we can't do it on our own as educators. We have to expand beyond the school campus.
I think the whole story of Lincoln is a community story. The reason we got the health center was because of community partners who saw the need. In fact, it was a pediatrician's vision. She came to me and asked me if we would like to have a health center. The faith-based community, they're the ones that did the construction work and paid for the construction work to get the facility ready up for us to open. Our hospital, their support, and it was just a collaborative experience. And with JJC, a probation officer has so much authority over these kids. They're more afraid if their probation officer comes on campus than if they see an officer come on campus. And we used to invite the probation officers to come in if they could, because we wanted to brag about how well their kids were doing. And before they would leave, they would say, hey, when we got a court appearance coming up, I'm gonna let the judge know what Jim shared with me. You could just see that meant a lot to the kids. And if they couldn't come in, I'd just say, hey, before you leave, hang on for a second. And then I would call the probation officer and either talk to him or leave a message on how well the kids were doing. So we had that collaboration that, our SRO, as he went up the ladder within the police department, he now is the main trainer for all officers in the area of trauma-informed practices. It was just a collaboration where we all worked around that. In the book, as you know, the student of concern system that we put in place, I think it's the most powerful strategy that we had. And I have other schools who adopt it have shared with me that it's the most powerful strategy that they have as well. And that's coming together. And if we know that one adult can change the life path of a student that's dealing with trauma, then that student of concern was, how many more adults can we put around this kid intentionally? How many more positive interactions during the day can we put together? We bring in the mental health professionals, and the health center, they weren't separate. They were part of our staff. We were one. And so we had the counselors there that were working with the kids, and if somebody needed further support, we would seek it out and bring it in. Just became a powerful model of keeping on top of our kids that were maybe surfacing up to the top that we were most concerned about, writing up action plans and staying with it until we could get to some kind of resolve.
And you're right, there's a whole chapter on students of concern. So, talk to us a little bit about, if no one's ever heard of that term, what that means, and maybe a little bit of a story behind that as well.
We all in our buildings, we all have students that are part of the main conversations that happen within a school. And unfortunately, and I've been guilty of this in my past, the kids that we talk about the most are those with behavior issues. The student of concern, when we first started, dealt with behavior. That was the main issue. But as we matured and as we grew in our knowledge with trauma-informed practices, we then started asking about, hey, so-and-so is isolating. We need to get somebody connected with them. We've become aware that Sally's parents are going through a terrible divorce. She seems very depressed. We need to get her into the health center for some counseling. Student of concern took on a much more holistic approach once we got rolling, saw the power of relationship and how important it is that kids see that it's not just one caring adult in the building, it's a group of caring adults. Well, there's many kids that that implementation really connected them. We saw some significant life changes. But as you know, nothing's 100%, and we had kids that could have been meth addiction or other issues that were so overriding that we weren't seeing maybe the results that we wanted. But I've always said, even though we can't reach 100%, there's no reason why we can't love them 100%. I've seen kids who failed under our care and that we lost, but got back on their feet maybe a year or 2 years later, and they come back to the family. They come back to those they know that love them because we're safe, and we've been able to reconnect kids after Lincoln. That's always been a great reminder to me that love unconditionally, and you never know when the kid's going to make that change. And then there's sometimes, as you know, you lose one. I just lost a kid 3 months ago. He took his life. He was a wonderful kid, just an awesome kid, kind, I don't know what was going on in his life. So there's pain that we all have to deal with as well in this journey. I've tried to use the pain to feel the desire to reach out more and to love more.
That's heartbreaking. And, that kind of brings me to my last question as we wrap this up about the time that we're dealing with right now with the pandemic. Because as you talk about suicide, as we've seen in the news over and over again, and you experience so personally, is that suicide rates are up. They're double in some districts. I read the other day in Clark County in Nevada, it's double what it was this time last year. And so it really brings to home how important this model is of connecting and the relationships and the power of relationships, because there is so much isolation right now. There is so much disconnect, as it, safely should be, but that's really the fallout of that. And just give us a few words to wrap this up on, again, just the power of relationship where we are now. And then, of course, post pandemic, we're going to have to do an awful lot of repair because there has been just so much disconnect. And I think we have to be really ready for that.
This is my personal feeling, and that is, I believe the separation and the distancing of our students, that more damage is happening than the risk of the virus itself having them in the building. As you said, the suicide rates are going up. I've heard in some areas they've gone up as high as 60%. We know that violent crime has just is almost out of control. And we know that many of our kids are exposed to that in their neighborhood and their homes. My heart just really goes out. I want these kids back in school. I want them back with an adult. I don't think we can connect with kids at a level virtually, obviously, that we can connect when we're face to face. And we're losing kids that they never would have expected, that because they're so lonely, and they miss their peers, they miss that social connection. And so I guess I go out on a limb, but I think we got to get our schools back open and help these kids out.
It is very, very damaging. But I also know, once we can do that, whether it's now or, every district's going to be different, every state is different. Well, my hope is then that we're all back in school, definitely by next August, September. But, that's a long way away. That's a long way to be experiencing that kind of isolation. So I just encourage also for anyone listening and I agree, Jim, that we can't make that same connection virtually. But if that is what it is, then we can't ignore that either. I think what has happened is that there's so much people are in survival and just getting through the day, getting through the Zoom session, getting through the academic material, that there has been this drop in the awareness of, oh, I'm also supposed to make a connection, because it is so different and it is actually very challenging. So I just encourage everyone, make sure we go back to those basics, as you've heard today from Jim and all these stories and concepts of how incredibly powerful the relationship is to our students, actually to all of us, but especially to our students who don't have that family connection that is solid, that is consistent, and is predictable as well. So, any last words, Jim, before we wrap this up? I so much appreciate you sharing your stories and your heart and your knowledge behind all of this.
I think our teachers are under more stress than they've ever been under. And I always stress the importance of self-care through this difficult time as well, that we've got to keep our teachers well so that we'll be able to take care of our kids. And self-care, I believe, is just a huge piece of that.
Indeed. And that's actually why we started TISC Conversations, to make sure that we are supporting you all that are on the front line under, like Jim says, the most amount of stress probably ever in your educational career. So yes, take care of yourselves. And thank you so much for joining me, Jim. I appreciate you more than I can tell you.
Thank you.
This has been TISC Conversations. I'm Heather Forbes with the Beyond Consequences Institute. For more trauma-informed resources, please visit beyondconsequences.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, love always prevails.